Hello again, Dezz Asante here from the TechMuze Academy, which is the place where we discuss two things primarily. That is music production and music marketing. How to make great music and then how to find people to share it with and grow a fan base and hopefully turn your hobby into a career. So that's what we discuss at TechMuze. Today on the show, I wanted to take a little bit of time to answer some listener and viewer questions that have come in of late. Some of them actually are a little old. I apologize for the delay in getting to these questions, but just want to knock two or three off of the list today if I can. So without further ado, let's dive into it. Most of the questions today are focusing around the first topic of conversation, which is music production. So let's stay there for this particular video, and we'll talk music marketing another day, okay? This is sponsored, of course, by mixlessons.com. If you are interested in upping your game, definitely go there and check out the free mini course, the video training series that I've put together for you called The 3 Simple Steps to Amazing Home Recordings. I'm pretty sure that you will find it valuable, as many people have mentioned that they have. So check that out, mixlessons.com. And let's get into our first question. First question comes from Bill McDonald. He wrote in a while back and said, hello, Dezz. I was wondering if you could help me out with a situation. I'm looking for a way to separate vocals from the melody in a track. I would really appreciate it. I wouldn't ask if it were not important. Well, Bill, to answer that question, now I did send you an email and we had a little bit of a discourse on the subject, but this is a question that I've received a couple of times in the past. People who want to remove a vocal, maybe for the purposes of creating a karaoke track or other reasons. But if you have a final mixed song, mixed and mastered, commercially produced recording, and you want to remove the vocals, unfortunately, they're really, in my experience, isn't really a good way to do that. There are some products and software products as well that claim to serve that purpose, but I have yet to experience one that really actually does work, especially if you really are trying to remove the vocal, not just sort of cancel out the center where the vocal normally lives in order to diminish the vocal a little bit. I've seen tools that will do that. The only other thing that comes to my mind is if the mix is very sparse, you might be able to get away with some success using Melodyne by Solemnity. Melodyne in its current versions has introduced a technology a few years ago called direct note access, or DNA. And it is a pretty cool technology that allows you to, what the software will do is will analyze the source material and it will pull it apart into its individual notes. So for example, let's say I had recorded the sound of an acoustic guitar with a single microphone and I just strummed a G chord, okay? If I open that up in Melodyne, it would analyze that one waveform and pick out all of the individual pitches that are contained within it, which is pretty amazing, which would allow me to not only remove certain notes, but I could alter them as well. So if I wanted to change that G major into a G minor, I could find all the B's and flatten them and achieve a G minor chord. Some basic theory there. If you don't understand that, you'll have to Google it or ask me a question and we can talk about it. So now the trouble is with removing a vocal is that if there was, maybe just a solo piano and a singer singing, Melodyne might be able to isolate just the melodic properties of the vocal, which would allow you to then grab them, move them, or delete them. Your results may vary. I don't know how clean it would be. I've never actually tried to do it myself, but Melodyne is probably the closest thing I can think of that has the ability to analyze a single stereo audio file and find information within it in that regard as far as pitches are concerned. So, Bill, I appreciate the question. Unfortunately, I don't have a real solid answer for you, but there's some food for thought, some things that you might want to check out, okay? Second up, we got a question from Dwayne. He says, Mr. Asante, thank you for reaching out. I produce music and have been studying mixing for the past year. I'm currently experimenting with different techniques in search of my sound, if you will. My concentration is R&B, and I'm looking to narrow down my choice when it comes to the use of delays and reverbs. I've found depth with reverb and width with delays in my mix. I currently struggle with clarity using these tools to gain a polish in the end result. I want to hear a piece and know that those tools are used, but it's not obvious. He says, I need less transients and more space between the individual elements, I suppose. Yeah, this is another question that I get in many different sort of ways. A lot is about getting that clarity. And it's something It's something that I remember. First of all, it's important to note that these are things that I'm personally still working on. Okay, despite the fact that I get on, video and on the podcast, and I do my best to share what I've learned with people, which can sometimes give people the mistaken impression that I'm an expert. Well, I suppose I have achieved a certain degree of expertise, but I'm a student just like you are. So take my opinion for what it's worth. But I definitely remember a point in my development where that was my biggest frustration, and I also remember the types of things that I was able to adjust in my hearing and listening skills and my listening environment that allowed me to actually start to solve this problem. Okay, so if getting this clarity in your mix and this width and depth is the thing that you're struggling with, what I recommend is, for starters, you kind of hinted at it in your question there, there is a less is more approach when it comes to reverbs and delays. As far as which reverbs and which delays that you should be using, well, that's a much more difficult question to answer, because every plugin has its own sound and character and controls. Some plugins, like a lot of impulse response type reverb plugins, you load the impulse response and you may have a few controls. Some of them actually have quite a few, but then there's other plugins that have just row upon row of knobs and options. Okay, so depending on your needs and your desires, you're going to have to make a personal choice as far as that goes, the tonal quality and the amount of options and control that you have over a given plugin. So I won't give you any specific recommendations. I can, however, tell you some of my favorites. I really enjoy the EMT Plate 140 from Universal Audio. That's a plate reverb, of course, emulation. I really love that plugin. And then there's also the stock convolution reverb plugin in Cubase. As you may know, I'm a Cubase user long time, and it's called Reverence. And I actually found, I can't remember where I found them. I think they were posted in either the Gear Sluts forums or KVR or something like that. Somebody had taken the time to grab impulse responses of all of the presets of the Bricasti M5, which is sort of a world famous reverb unit. You hear Dave Pensato talking about it a lot. That's one of his go-tos as far as that is concerned. So oftentimes I'll use some Bricasti impulse responses because I can't afford a $5,000 reverb unit, and I'll use those inside of Reverence. So there's a couple that I like to mess with. But as far as maintaining that clarity, first thing is the less is more. There's two ways to approach a reverb or a delay. One of them is as a treatment to achieve a psychoacoustic illusion. So in order to create the illusion of space and depth and distance, okay, to basically recreate what happens in the physical world digitally. Okay, so for example, if I'm standing in a room that is 10 feet square and I speak and I am 2 inches away from your ear, that's going to have a certain sound. The direct sound that hits your ear versus the sound of the first order reflections that come back to your ear a split second later will have a very specific and unique sound. However, if I'm in that same 10 foot by 10 foot room, but now I'm 3 feet away from you, that's going to have a different sound to it. And we can achieve these differences by the way in which we use our reverbs and delays. Now, conversely, if I'm 3 feet away from you, but the room is 100 foot square and is made of tile, then that's going to have a different physical effect on the way the sound bounces around the room and what ultimately ends up hitting your ear. So one way of using these effects plugins is to recreate the physical properties that you're trying to achieve as far as what you want the listener to experience. Now, the other way to use these effects is what I just refer to as an effect. If you want something to sound echoey or reverby, like big, larger than life type sounds, you can use these same plugins to do those kinds of things. So that's the first thing, is if you're trying to achieve this clarity and naturalness to your mix, first of all, you want to be using them to recreate the psychoacoustic effects that happen in a real physical space, as opposed to using them as an effect. And oftentimes that is the first step towards that is pulling them back, so that you can oftentimes barely even notice that they're active But when you disengage the plugin, all of a sudden things sound very two-dimensional and right up front in your face. There's other factors that will contribute to that as well, but speaking specifically of reverb. So definitely a more subtle approach to your reverbs and delays. But another thing that I found in my own practice that goes a long way to adding clarity to and separation in your mix is to get rid of a lot of the low frequency information from your effects returns, from your effects buses. So if you've got a reverb on a stereo bus and you're sending things to that reverb, on that stereo bus, that effects send, put a high pass filter on it, drag it out to the right until you start to feel as though the reverb itself is losing some of its critical body and character, the stuff that you do want to remain in the signal. I found that simple technique alone will go a long way to helping you to get that clarity that you're so desperately seeking, which I can totally relate to. So treating them very, very subtly and rolling off a lot of that low end information, more than you might imagine. Experiment with this. Oftentimes I'll roll off everything below 1K and down. Sometimes I'll go even further, depending on the situation. Every musical circumstance is unique, of course. But I hope that helps. That I appreciate the question. Let's see who else we got on the docket today. We'll just do a couple more. We got a question that came in from Tony Bailey. He says, "Hey Dezz, I really appreciate your blogs and the information is invaluable." Thank you, Tony. Appreciate that. One thing I would like help with is mixing in mono. I've been mixing this way and I really like the way my mixes have been turning out. However, I would love to know how you achieve separation in your mixes with EQ, etc. Thank you, sir. And again, here we're back to that separation and clarity struggle that we all go through at some point or another. I still struggle with it myself. Every session is a little different and sometimes different strategies are required. But if we're talking about mixing in mono, it is a helpful practice. I've put out videos on this and podcasts on this topic before. Something I recommend that you try, and again, there's no hard and fast rules for any of this type of thing, is what I like to do is I'll go through when I begin my mix after I've gone through my organizational phase. First, I like to organize my screen, make sure everything's labeled correctly, color-coded, routed the way I want it to be routed in a hierarchical system so that, the three toms are going to a tom fader, the tom fader is going to an all drums fader, the all drums fader is going to the stereo out, etc., right? So everything is routed correctly and all that. Let's assume that that's all said and done and I'm ready to start listening and touching the faders. I like to keep everything straight down the middle. I don't touch a pan pot at this point in the game, and I'll begin by just getting a balance on my faders, okay? And then from there, I'll start getting into some of the vertical dimension, which is your frequency distribution. I'll get into some of those decisions. So this is primarily using my EQ and my volume faders to make sure that with everything right on top of each other in the middle in mono, there's no stereo things going on yet. And even if I do have stereo tracks, like maybe a string section or a synth pad or something like that, I have on my control center here, I have an SM Pro Audio, what's it called now? It's an M-Patch 2, which is basically my big volume knob and speaker select and whatnot. And it has a mono switch. So I'll flick that switch to mono so it forces everything in my system to mono, regardless of if the tracks are stereo or not, okay? So if you have something like that at your disposal, that's a good place to begin. But the reason I do this is because with everything coming straight at me down the middle in mono, it's much easier for me to hear when there's frequency competition. If, let's say, for example, a particular electric guitar tone is got very similar frequency content to, say, for example, maybe a dirty B3 organ kind of deep purple type sound, maybe they're sort of similar. Maybe they both got that sort of distortion, mid-rangey kind of character to them. Then when they're both sitting right on top of each other, it's really obvious that they start to mask each other out and I lose the definition and distinction between those two parts. So I'll grab my EQ and my faders and I'll try to draw differences between those two parts so that even while they're still sitting directly on top of one another, that they have more distinction, more definition, and I can hear them, I can pick them out with my ear much more easily after I've carved away some EQ and whatnot. A lot of times I'm removing low end information from most tracks in my mix, because that bottom end is that sacred area that really you can really only have one thing down there, because those frequencies are so high energy, long wavelength that they don't compete very well. They don't play nice together, okay? So I'm using my EQ at this stage just to sort of shape everything so that I can quickly discern what all the parts are, and that there's as little frequency masking as I can get away with. You're not going to completely eliminate every potential frequency conflict. That's not the goal. It's just to get the best frequency balance between your mix with your EQ and your faders as you can. Okay. From there, once I feeling good about that, from there I'll grab my pan pots and start throwing things left and right as to whatever the strategy is that I've decided to try to achieve. And that's always one of my favorite parts of the mix process, because all of a sudden everything opens up and becomes just gloriously wide, even though we haven't touched reverbs, delays, stereo enhancement, or anything like that, and normally move on to those phases a little bit later. So that's how I approach it. That's why I spend a good portion of my mix in mono. Now also, even after I've gotten deeper into the mix process and I'm getting closer to the end, I will occasionally flip my system back into mono just to make sure that I haven't missed any phase issues. Sometimes what will happen is you'll flick to mono and all of a sudden it sounds like the lead guitar during the solo in the bridge is further away than you intended, or is quieter than you intended. And it's because of phase cancellation issues. Certain frequencies are canceling each other out when they're flipped back into mono. So it's always a good habit to check in mono and make sure that you're not creating problems for yourself down the road. Okay, so hopefully that's helpful to you, and I appreciate the question. We'll just do one or two more here. Okay, so this question is from Elwin, and Elwin writes in, I'm so happy I ran into your video on YouTube. From here, I took your free lessons, which I'm really, really happy for. There is something I want to ask. Many great songs I listen to have this polished sound, which makes them sound compact and fit together, and he puts in brackets tight. What I really mean is, let's say you build a chair out of wood and it's well sanded and smooth, and you add a coat of clear varnish to it, and then wow, it pops. It looks and feels even better. Is there something like this that I'm talking about in my question? What can you do to your final mix that will give it that polished sound? And then he apologizes for his broken English. I'm not sure where you're from, Elwin, but your English is just fine. I understood what you're getting at, and I appreciate the question. There seems to be a bit of a general theme going on to the questions today, getting that polish, getting that space, getting that clarity. Well, I like your building a chair, your woodworking analogy, but I would alter it a little bit. I would say that during the mix phase, this polish that you speak of, it's more like you've built a chair out of rough lumber, right? You've cut the wood, you've designed it, you've put it all together. It's all glued and nailed and screwed and everything that it needs to be, and it's now a functioning chair. That's kind of like the recording process. And during your mix, it's like the finish sanding. It's like going from the rough grit and down to the thinner grit and the finer grit until you've got wood that is just baby bottom smooth. That's the level of polish that, to stick with your analogy, that I'm going for in the mix process. So the recording engineer, whether that was me or somebody else, has built the chair. It's a beautiful chair, it's functional chair, it's got nice scroll work and art and so forth. It's my job to get it sanded and smooth so that it's almost finished. Now that final level of polish, that coat of lacquer and that clear coat that just makes it pop and gleam, that's the mastering engineer. And that's the mastering process, okay? That's where you're going to make those ever so subtle decisions, where you're going to have somebody who hopefully has a beautiful listening environment, high-end gear, so that they're not adding any color, and they can hear the absolute honest truth of the audio, and then they can pull it to its full potential, using both science technique and just a great ear and an intuition for what the genre requires, because different genres might be mastered differently. I'm actually in the process of putting together some information on the mastering process. It may turn into another course for the TechMuze Academy. I'm uncertain yet. I'm going to put it together, and I'm going to actually run it past some of my mastering engineer friends to make sure that I haven't misinformed anybody or missed anything. And once I've gotten that sort of feedback, then we'll consider putting it out. If that's something you're interested in, by the way, a course on mastering, let me know. Shoot me an email. Head over to techmuseacademy.com and use the SpeakPipe widget and send me a voicemail. Let me know what your thoughts are, because obviously if you want it, I'll make it. If you don't want it, then I won't waste my time. I'm studying mastering and practicing mastering and actually doing some work in the field of mastering myself now to hone my skills. And so when I feel good about it, I'll put something together. But yeah, ultimately speaking, Elwin, that coda lacquer is the mastering process, and it's a subtle process. You're not doing, if the mastering engineer makes an alteration by a full dB, that's a pretty drastic, a pretty dramatic alteration in the mastering phase. In the mixing phase, we're moving up and down 2, 3, 4, 5 dB all the time. In the mastering phase, however, that's the moves are much, much more subtle, and that's where you achieve that polish, that fine-tuned frequency curve where everything is just nice, okay? So it's beyond the scope of today's conversation, but I just thought that it was a cool little analogy that you used there, and I just wanted to sort of give you my alteration on it and focus on the finish sanding of your chair, and then hire somebody or study to do the mastering, to put the lacquer on it. Okay, I appreciate the question, and feel free to chime in every time you have something that you need to know. Let's just do one more to finish up for today. Today we have last one here, a question from Justin D'Souza, who is from India, which I think is fantastic. The way the internet, we can speak to people all over the world. That makes me giddy to some degree. Justin was the only person who indicated where he was from, so I appreciate that because it really makes me happy. Okay, so he says, Happy New Year 2016, Dezz. You're doing a great job. Carry on. We're very happy to be a part of your music academy. Thank you, by the way, for that. I appreciate it. I want to ask you a very important question. When I'm mixing, what needs to be the first steps in the three-dimensional mixing process? Should I touch the faders first? Should I change the depth strategy, EQ, compression, first the vertical changes, or panning first or second, etc., etc.? Could you please help me with this? Justin D'Souza from India. Well, Justin, I guess now that I think about it, I kind of illustrated my approach in one of the previous questions there about the mixing in mono. That's sort of the method that I like to use. I like to begin with everything panned down the center, everything in mono. I like to start with my faders to get a general balance so things aren't popping out ridiculously over the top or things aren't buried and you can't hear them, okay? So once I've got a general balance with the faders, then I'll proceed to pull up the EQs and start to carve away things. I'm not boosting anything. I think of it much like a sculptor. You got a big piece of stone, and in there somewhere is a piece of art, and you have to remove what you don't want to unveil the art beneath, okay? So that's what I'm doing at this phase. I'm solving problems. I'm removing the things that I don't want in the mix, things that are going to cause problems or are already causing problems. Frequency competition and masking, things overlapping too much so that they lose their definition and clarity, and you're not able to clearly and quickly pick them out. If you hear a sound right away and you have a split second of hesitation whether that was the guitar or the organ, using the example I used previously, then you know that there's some work that needs to be done there, okay? So that's what I will do in the first phase after I've, like I mentioned earlier, after I've organized everything on the screen and done my routing and all of that stuff, okay? And then when I feel like I've got a really nice sort of static balance between the volume relationships between the tracks and the frequency relationships between the tracks, I'm starting to get a little bit of clarity in the bottom end, beginning to, it takes a little while. The bottom end is oftentimes a difficulty for people, that I've got that definition. From there, I will begin to implement my my horizontal strategy and start panning things off to the left and to the right as far as their static position is concerned, okay? Once I've got a nice wide stereo image to work with. And it's interesting too how much wider that stereo image becomes when you've started from that mono position, because you've tackled a lot of the stuff that you would lose. For example, if that guitar and that organ that we've been talking about that have very similar frequency content, if they're already panned to the left and to the right, your ear's gonna pick them out quickly because they're on two different sides of the stereo field. So you won't necessarily notice that they mask each other out and the frequencies balance a little bit. So I like to do that kind of work in mono. And then occasionally, once I have panned things out, sometimes things begin to seem like little tiny satellites all over the place, as opposed to this nice, Milky Way galaxy that I'm trying to create, right? And that's because when in mono, it's so obvious about the frequency competition that perhaps I've removed a little too much and been a little overzealous. So once I've panned things out, if things start to sound disconnected, then I may come in and add some of the frequency content that I removed back into those parts so that they join together a little bit more, like puzzle pieces. Okay, so that's just something to be aware of and to listen for. And so once I've done that, then at that point is when I start to consider my depth strategy, what I want the space to sound like, the reverb choices and delay choices, things that are enhancing in nature, like stereo widening effects, or something that I'll use a lot is a plugin. One of my favorite plugins is called The Voice of God by Universal Audio, VOG. It's sort of a low-end, low-mid enhancement style plugin. You'll have to Google it for a more appropriate definition as to what it does. UAD website is probably the best place to go for that information. But it has this very interesting way of adding girth to an element in a way that's different than just your EQ. And I don't know the technology behind it. I just know what it does to my ear and to the audio. So oftentimes, for example, if a vocal is sounding good but thin, rather than reaching for my EQ and throwing on, adding some more low-end information or low-mid information to it, oftentimes I'll reach for the VOG, and it has just this more subtle way of adding a throaty girthiness to a track, like snare drum, for example, that woody thunk of a snare drum. If that's the sound I'm going for, I can often get that. So I use those kind of enhancement style effects at this stage as well. And then from there, once things are really starting to shape up and I feel like I've got a really presentable static mix, I start to consider my automation. So what do I want? How do I want to draw the listener through this piece of music? A piece of music is just a piece of time, right, populated by sound. And so I want to draw the listener's ear to the things that I feel are important, that really pull out the message of the music. Maybe it's a lyrical thing. Perhaps there's, a line or a phrase that I feel is important to the message of the lyric that I may want to draw the attention to. I might do something like a little delay throw, or I might, do something by moving the harmony vocals in a different position or something that grabs the ear's attention. These are all just random examples off the top of my head, but point is that that's the phase that I get to at the end, is that automation. And I believe that's one of the most important elements of the mixing process. And I believe that's also where you can really start to get creative and add your own thumbprint to the sound of the final mix. Okay, so I hope that helps you, Justin. I appreciate the question, and I hope those of you who are watching and listening to the podcast got a little bit of meat off those bones there. And once again, this is sponsored by mixlessons.com. So if you haven't done so, mixlessons.com, it costs you nothing but a click. Throw your email in to let me know where I should be sending this video training series that is free, called The 3 Simple Steps to Amazing Home Recordings. And we will talk again very soon.